hoping to show you IDC today. Get brownie points for bringing you some nice green soybean plants to look at, but obviously there's no IDC here. What we have, though, you can use your imagination to pretend that these plants have increasing IDC. So in soybeans, our soybean roots release organic acids into the soil, and that solubilizes iron. The reason why we want iron in our plants is because it's essential to produce chlorophyll. Chlorophyll, if you'll recall from your science classes, is that green pigment that absorbs the sun's energy and then uses it to combine water and carbon dioxide molecules to form sugars and eventually yield. Sometimes plant pathologists are really clever in coming up with disease names. Iron deficiency chlorosis tells you exactly what's going on. So the plant is deficient in iron and it's chlorotic, or that's a fancy term for yellow. So it doesn't have enough chlorophyll that it needs, and so that's why it's yellow. In western Minnesota and eastern North Dakota, some of our soils have high calcium carbonate content. So this is one of the things I added to try and get you some IDC symptoms here today. This calcium carbonate has very small particles next to our soybean roots. As the soybean roots release those organic acids, this acts as a buffer. So it essentially neutralizes those acids, leaving iron in not as soluble of a form. So what we have here is some data that shows that with increasing calcium carbonate content, relative yield decreases. Another risk factor that we have is high soil moisture. So we tend to have poorly drained soils in our area. Another thing I did is you can probably see they were sitting in water here. What happens when we have a lot of soil moisture is that decreases gas exchange. So the roots release CO2 when they respire. Microbes in the soil also release CO2. That gets dissolved in water and becomes bicarbonate ions. Those do just what you would expect, neutralizes again those organic acids. You might sense a theme here. So high soil nitrate content is another risk factor, and this is something to really pay attention to for this coming year. There's two theories in the scientific community. One is that when plant roots take up nitrate ions, the roots release materials and it actually increases pH in the soil, again, neutralizing those organic acids. There's also another theory, competing theory, that the plants are able to take up and accumulate some iron in the leaf tissue, but it remains outside of the cells. It can't pass the cell membrane where it's needed to do its job. The reason why we should really care about that this year is because AgVice Labs recently released their soil test summary from last year, and people submitted a lot of samples after last year's drought. Top 2 feet of soil that people sampled, 37% of those fields that were sampled after wheat and 32% after corn had nitrate concentrations of 81 pounds per acre or higher. And if Dr. Dave Franzen's worried about 80 pounds per acre, I think we need to be worried too. So if you haven't yet sampled your soil after a crop that you've added nitrogen to, make sure you do that before planting soybean there. There does seem to be somewhat of a relationship between added fertilizer nitrogen, yield, and varietal susceptibility to IDC. So this line that's kind of sloping downward here, that's an IDC susceptible variety. We have an IDC intermediate variety and then a resistant variety. This gentleman chose a representative variety from each category. I'm not sure just how widespread that relationship is, but it's something you can ask about during the panel discussion a little bit later today. Another risk factor in our area, like I said, we already talked about how we have poorly drained soils. We also have high wind speeds, and we have a lot of clay content in some of our soils. What does that do? That wicks salts further up in the soil profile. What we have here is some data showing soil electrical conductivity on the x-axis. The higher the number, the more salts in the soil, and then relative soybean yield on the y. You can see with increasing salt content, that can decrease that relative soybean yield. So if you can increase pencil out drainage, that's something to consider. But the main ways of managing IDC, one is varietal resistance. So this sheet I handed to you, the page without any pictures, that's traded soybean varieties. On the left-hand side of the page with pictures, also traded. On the left-hand side, right-hand side, this is conventional varieties. This is the NDSU Variety Testing Program, IDC, testing results. They use this rating scale here, where 1, there's no IDC, all the way up to 5, where there's so much IDC that it kills the plants outright. So I did get to see, a gentleman showed me on his phone, he hosted one of these trials last year, and he had a really good location to house this experiment, because it looked like literally somebody took a blowtorch to certain parts of his field. So this is good and impartial data. I'm sure most of you have made your variety selections, but if you haven't, this is always a really good resource. The thing is, with our conventional varieties that are listed right here, the lowest score is about 1.2, the highest is about 4.2, and the average is 2.2. So there's a considerable variation in there. What research has shown is that for each 1 point increase in IDC score, that will tend to, on average, reduce yield by about 20%. So it's really important to select a good IDC variety. There has been some work showing that there can be a yield drag with that IDC resistance trait. And basically, some people would recommend that you just target to plant IDC resistant varieties to those areas of the field where you have a problem. And then use variety trial, so hopefully impartial variety trial results to select varieties for the rest of your field. If you are curious about yields, I didn't look up all of these varieties, but do know that in the variety trials that NDSU also puts on, many of these same varieties for their IDC trials are included in the yield trials as well. So basically, the other main way of managing IDC is to use chelated iron in furrow. They'll probably talk a little bit more about the different forms of iron during the panel discussion a little bit later on. But this, I think, paints a really good picture. So this is some work by Dr. Goose's graduate student many years ago. He's now emeritus professor, Dr. Goose, but this is really great research. So what we have here is chlorosis score along the bottom, and we have soybean yield along the top. We have susceptible variety, intermediate, and resistant. And what you can see here is the red dots are those particular varieties planted without in-furrow iron, and the green dots are with in-furrow iron. You can see when planting a susceptible variety and using iron in furrow, you can decrease your IDC score and increase yield a bit, but it won't get you up to where you would be just planting an intermediate or resistant variety alone without iron. And so this just kind of shows us the relative contribution of both main management strategies. And so it's definitely something to keep in mind. I think I might be getting the hook right here. I don't know. So many people coming in from different directions, but I sure appreciate seeing all of you here today, and it was great to see you and see you all in person.